Well, Congressman Ro Khanna represents California's 17th district in the U.S. House of Representatives and is author of the new book, Dignity in a Digital Age, Making Tech Work for All of Us. Congressman Khanna, welcome to the Climate Pod.
I'm excited to be on. I've heard a lot of great things from climate activists and many people.
Well, wonderful. So what made you want to write Dignity in a Digital Age?
I had a sense that people are uneasy, uncomfortable, lack a sense of agency in a technological age. I mean, in my district, you have young people growing up so optimistic about the future, and there's been huge wealth creation in Silicon Valley. But in many other parts of the country, there isn't a sense that here's the economic opportunities in a modern economy for my kids, and here's how I can stay in my hometown and still do that. Nor is there a sense that you can design the architecture to participate as a citizen on digital platforms and that you can actually make a contribution to our public debate. So those are the two things that I wanted to tackle.
Yeah, you return often to this theme of democratizing the digital economy throughout the book. So how do we do that? How do we democratize the digital economy?
There are two parts to it, the economic and the citizenship. On the economic part, we have to have more people have access to the wealth generation and economic opportunities of a modern digital economy than just people in a few big cities. The reality is that so many parts of the economy are being digitized, whether it's manufacturing, whether it's retail, whether it's health, whether it's commerce. And so many of these 25 million jobs that are going to exist by 2025 are in a handful of areas. We have to be very deliberate about saying we can create these jobs in the Midwest, in the South, in Black and brown communities, like Intel is doing in Columbus, $20 billion. That's an example of that. And then there's the broader point of citizenship. We shouldn't have Jack Dorsey and Mark Zuckerberg make all of the rules of how we participate in these online platforms. Climate disinformation being one key issue. I mean, is it really that a number of people in Silicon Valley should get to decide the rules for what public discourse is going to be on the climate or on race? That seems to me wrong. And so how do we give more people around the country an opportunity to design what are the new medium in the public sphere, and that is these digital platforms.
Yeah, and what problems do you see now with technology companies that are keeping the digital economy from being more democratic?
One is just a default to the status quo. So for the longest time, everyone, if you wanted to start a company, they'd say, come to Sand Hill Road. A lot of the venture capital was there. Stanford and Berkeley were there. These companies were there. Now you had COVID, you've had a forced experiment with remote work. And suddenly people realize, wow, there's talent all over the place. And we don't need everyone to move to Silicon Valley. And we can decentralize. So it's a change in mindset. Two, you do need the collaboration to have people have employable skills and employable opportunities. And that has to be in collaboration with community colleges in the private sector, land-grant universities in the private sector. A lot of times that basic training isn't there. And three, you need the capital to be decentralized. You can't have all the capital just in Silicon Valley or Massachusetts or New York.
Yeah, it's clear that, we've got to be able to create more digital jobs throughout the country. But there is some concern, so, on my part, and I think there's a lot of people that share this concern with the tech companies kind of dropping into some of these communities and what they might do. I mean, are you concerned that the tech companies and their executives are just going to extract value from those employees and those communities and basically keep that value concentrated just to the shareholders, which is basically what they've been doing for a long time?
It's a very important point, a very good point. And there are two aspects to it. First, 2/3 of jobs in this country are still not digital jobs. You don't need a computer for it. And we have to keep that in mind. And so certainly there is an extractive model where people who are working, for example, at Amazon warehouses or in many parts of janitors or bus drivers or security guards for large tech companies or food workers are not getting the wages that they deserve, aren't participating in the gains of the economy, and are often rent burdened because they are often living in these areas which you've had huge housing price inflation because of techies, and they now aren't getting the salaries, and they are facing huge housing costs. So what I argue in the book is, one, we need much more affordable housing in these places which have tech centers. Two, we need to increase the wages of workers and empower them. And three, you're not going to have the exacerbated conditions in Silicon Valley if you're just creating some digital opportunities and jobs, and that's being driven locally. I'm not for trying to replicate Silicon Valley all over the place with all of the problems also that the Valley has, but for communities to make these decisions themselves and see what is the appropriate balance. But having some tech-generated employment and business activity actually will be bringing the revenue in instead of having all of that in offshore. And these jobs are the middle-class jobs, many of them of the 21st century, $80,000, twice the median income. And some of them may lead to small businesses, local businesses, which is why I champion things like the right to repair and antitrust, to show that you don't want all of the value extraction just to come to a few handful of big companies.
Yeah, I mean, what do you think Congress can do to make sure, that the workers are compensated and protected? That's such a that's such a critique. Companies like Amazon, like Uber, Lyft, where they're just not, treating their employees or their workers fairly. What can Congress do to make sure that doesn't happen?
We can pass laws that make it easier to unionize. We can pass laws to make sure that employees are treated as employees, not independent contractors. We can give employees more voice in their company by having employees have some people on the board of directors. The reality is, as bad as it may be to have a human boss, it's much worse, in my view, to have an algorithm as your boss. And a lot of these companies, you have basically some of the workers being treated as appendages or accessories to robots. I talk in the book in Kenosha, Wisconsin, about how manufacturing left. You had deindustrialization, $30 jobs left. Now you have an Amazon warehouse, you have $15, $17 jobs. Folks have to do it because that's one of the only economic opportunity, but they don't have the same pride. They don't have the same sense of dignity as they did in those manufacturing jobs. So we have to create that, and we can do that through certain laws at the federal level that protect and empower workers.
Yeah, and I think that, that Kenosha example is such a great example of, Amazon's relentless focus on cutting costs, right? They want to do everything they possibly can to cut costs, including, right, not paying their workers fairly or providing protective equipment, things like that. That all comes back to this mentality of maximizing shareholder value, because all that value then just gets sucked up by the company and then distributed to the shareholders. How do we change what seems to be a systemic problem within tech of that extraction of value to just the richest people?
Well, I agree with a lot of the premise behind the question. But first, your point is a good one about the cost cutting and the goal being low consumer prices. And this is partly why I call the book Dignity in a Digital Age, that human dignity means more than just getting the cheapest goods and more than just a focus on consumerism. And for the longest time, I think in our country, we've just had a policy, how can we get the cheapest possible things? And it doesn't matter what the cost is. But people want to contribute. They want not just the redistribution. We want to tax not just Zuckerberg and Bezos with more, which we should. I'm for, a billionaire's tax and for these companies paying more of a tax. But we want more than just taxing them and redistributing. We want people to actually have the opportunity to contribute in a meaningful way. But freedom is not that fully meaningful if you just have freedom as a citizen, but in your job, which consumes 40, 50, 60 hours a week, you don't feel free. You don't feel autonomous. You feel that everything is being dictated to you. So the first point is that we have to empower workers through laws, the right type of employer laws, the right type of unionizing laws. The second point is that we need to have reforms in the corporate laws. We ought to have a minimum tax, so these corporations are actually paying tax. We ought to be critical of stock buybacks, so you can't just have people making money and inflating profits that way. And we ought to increase the minimum wage to $15. That will then have an upward pressure on wages. So there's no doubt in my mind that even if you hit the lottery and get a job at Amazon, you think, you're working at one of the richest companies ever invented in human history, and you still can't have a middle-class decent life, you can see how frustrating that is. The digital age has to work for workers as well, and right now it's not.
Yeah, I definitely want to talk about taxes because I think that's really important to this conversation. Last week, I spoke with Peter S. Goodman, author of the new book Davos Man, which explores basically how the ultra rich have been allowed to rewrite the rules of our political system and not pay taxes, which then starves the public services of these much needed resources. What needs to be done to ensure that these technology billionaires pay their fair share of taxes in order for America to pay for, a lot of the public services that you propose in your book?
I love the title, by the way, Davos Man. I think I'm going to go order that right now. The reality is this with these Silicon Valley billionaires, some of them I admire and admire their contributions. So I don't mean this to come off as overly harsh, but they are not self-made in the conception that they think of themselves as self-made for two reasons. They're not often people like Donald Trump who've inherited millions of dollars. They tend to be upper middle class. But you look at their backgrounds, and they tend to be the kids of lawyers or doctors who've gone to a private school or a very, very good public school in a very affluent area, who have never had to worry about healthcare, who have the luxury to take risks because they know there's a fallback in terms of their economic security, and who have grown up in relatively safe neighborhoods. And so the question that is, how do we create those conditions for everyone else? And that is the public investments I'm talking about: healthcare for everyone, education for everyone, nutrition for everyone. And it doesn't seem to me too much to ask to say, well, if you've made billions of dollars, we're going to tax that. If you made hundreds of millions of dollars at a rate so we can pay to give everyone a shot to participate in the market economy. And by the way, you're still going to have people investing in Facebook and Google and Apple because when they're investing, they're looking for 1,000 times return. They're not looking at whether the marginal tax rate is 37% or 39% or 28% of capital gains. It's just not how people invest. And the second quick point is they're also building off huge government investment in DARPA that created the internet.
Exactly. Yes, they're basically using all those public services. They're benefiting from it, but they're not paying for it. And I think that's got to be critical. We've got to figure out how to get them to pay their fair share of taxes. So what is it? Why do you think it's been so hard to increase capital gains taxes or increase the estate tax or even add a wealth tax?
I don't know. It pulls off the charts. I mean, the billionaire tax, and I'm still hopeful with we're in the midst of Build Back Better, and I've had conversations with people on the Senate side, and I've said, look, the billionaire tax should be appealing everywhere. Basically, what we're saying with the billionaire tax is tax my district so that we can help invest in Middle America and South Carolina. And you got the congressman from Silicon Valley saying, tax us, we're fine with it. I mean, I don't understand why we can't get that through. I guess my cynical point is the lobbyists always find the one or two people that they need to stop. And this is what people often don't fully get about Congress. It's not like you have a swarm of lobbyists coming to all 435 members and 100 senators. They will figure out one or two people on a particular committee or a particular senator who, if they just get that person to say no, the whole thing dies. And they're very adept at that. And that's why you have popular policies like getting rid of the carried interest loophole, taxing billionaires, that isn't becoming law. And it's very frustrating. It drives part of the cynicism of the political process.
For sure. Yeah, definitely. And you talk about, America's democracy and how it really is under threat right now. We've seen that play out in the last couple of years. And the conspiracy theories, all the fake news, all the hate speech that was allowed to spread across the major tech platforms like Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, et cetera, those radicalized the very people that stormed the Capitol. So, what do you say to the idea that the technology platforms as they exist today are actually a threat to democracy rather than a way of strengthening democracy?
They're both. There's no doubt that QAnon rose on Facebook and YouTube, and it was because you had these platforms literally target the most vulnerable people for that message, pushing recommending the content to them. And that's absolutely wrong. And they need to think more of their responsibility in a democratic society to the public good, to the public discourse. Even if you can't regulate some of that under the First Amendment, some of the things you can regulate, you shouldn't allow them to capture all this data that allows them to engage in micro-targeting, and you shouldn't allow them to have things on that incite violence. But even if you can't regulate all of the details because they have certain First Amendment rights, they certainly have an ethical obligation, in my view, to see themselves as new media companies and think of their role in the public sphere. And they haven't done that enough. That said, there are positives. I mean, the Black Lives Matter movement, the Me Too movement, the sense of human rights that are on social media. Some of the speech, even of progressives in my caucus, probably would never make it onto a big cable news channel, but can get traction on social media, the language of protest. So what we have to do is appreciate the decentralization of voice that technology has allowed, the podcasts that we're on currently allowed by technology, and yet understand that there has to be an ethics that emerges on how these public forums actually promote deliberation as opposed to just misinformation.
Yeah, but I think there's just there's a big difference between being able to be that platform, right, for the democratization of speech, and then also monetizing hate speech, right? And there's plenty of evidence, even research by Facebook itself, that says the kind of content that increases engagement is this fear or hate inducing content. And that means, with greater engagement, they can serve more ads, they can make more money. So how do you fix a company whose business model relies on the spread of hateful content?
Couple points. First of all, you're absolutely right. 9 of the top 10 Facebook sites are very conservative right-wing sites. And people like Ben Shapiro and Sean Hannity and Donald Trump, when we look at it, are the top 9 of the 10 sites. So this idea of censoring conservative speech is just factually false. And you're right that the speech that goes most viral is often provocative, inflammatory, and often speech that is hate. Now, there are 2 things to it. One, I think Facebook ought to have more editorial standards to take down things that are explicitly racist, explicitly sexist, and just say that's not on our platform. Doesn't mean that you're telling someone they don't have the First Amendment right to say that. They just don't have to say that on your platform. Just like they may, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, or NBC may say, okay, you can hate, but don't hate on our platform. And there is a value in having hate speech be fringe and not be mainstream, not be broadcast to everyone, because then it's more possibility of ostracizing it and containing it. The second point, though, is not all things platforms have to engage in gossip and trash. That if you had more competition law, if you had more restrictions on the use of data, you may allow new platforms to emerge that aspire to be the PBS or to aspire to be a higher order conversation starters. You could create public sphere, public actually discourse sites as well. And so what I argue is we need a multiplicity of these spaces. And Here, you actually may have a convergence between liberals and conservatives. They say we don't want Dorsey and Zuckerberg and all controlling all the speech. I said, yeah, fine. Let's have a multiplicity, and hopefully, with the proper standards, we will see some better sites emerge that take their responsibility on actually thoughtful exchange more seriously.
Yeah, clearly you have a really incredible grasp of technology, unlike maybe a lot of your congressional colleagues. But Speaker Pelosi tasked you with drafting the Internet Bill of Rights. So can you explain what that is?
Internet Bill of Rights is simple. It says when you're online, what rights should you have? Now, these are not formal rights of political philosophy, right? Obviously, we have certain human rights, the right to our liberty, the right to our bodies. But the question is, how do those materialize? To be able to be free, what does that mean in an online context? And one of the things I argue, and I work with Tim Berners-Lee, the founder of the World Wide Web, on this, is that you really have to have a right to your data, because otherwise, if I'm taking your data and I'm using your data to help Donald Trump win, I am sort of depriving you of your agency as a citizen. I'm taking something from you. Or if I take your data without your consent and I'm manipulating you by showing you certain images to induce a certain type of action, then you're not fully free on that forum. Or if you're not able to be free in the best sense of a citizen, where you can talk to other fellow citizens and engage in action, then I'm depriving you of what it means to be a full citizen. And so the Internet Bill of Rights says you need to opt in before you give your data. These platforms need to have a fiduciary responsibility of not bombarding you with requests for data, and that there needs to be a respect for the autonomy, for the agency of people online.
Is this voluntary, or are these, proposed legislations to make these companies actually do this?
Legislation. There's no way that the voluntary thing is not going to work. They've had a lot of time to be voluntary. And in both the Internet Bill of Rights part and the antitrust part, I say, no, there has to be there have to be rules. Now, the rules are not sufficient, because I am a strong believer in the First Amendment, and there are things we can do on the rules to strengthen the protection for people and prevent some of the most egregious speech. But there's also an ethics that needs to emerge to supplement the rules, just like there is on broadcast television or newspapers. So it's both. It's calling for rules and regulations, and then reform of the culture of social media.
Well, despite the way that many have created and used it, technology can definitely be a force for good, and access to that technology must be equitable in order for it to do the most good. And there's still a huge chunk of Americans that don't even have access to high-speed, reliable internet. How can Congress fix that?
These are table stakes. I mean, if you want to participate in the modern economy as a consumer, a producer, you need to have access to high-speed internet. And if you want to participate as a citizen, you need to have access to the high-speed internet. About 20% who don't have affordable access. I'm actually proud of the infrastructure bill. This is one thing it did that gave about $60 billion to the Department of Commerce and FCC to be distributed. And if that is distributed correctly, we will see much more high-speed internet to rural communities, to places left out. And then the FCC has gotten a chunk of that money to help provide assistance to people to get high-speed internet. I mean, it can cost, 30, 40, $50 a month. That's not cheap for a lot of working families. So the implementation now is the key, but we finally have allocated the resources to be able to do it.
And we need every sector of our economy to be engaged with and helpful in the transition to a more sustainable planet. How can technology companies play a role in this transition?
Well, there are two things about technology. We think of technology often as social media and searches, but there's actually technology which is needed in terms of dealing with climate. And there's technology in building the batteries that we're going to need, the battery storage that we're going to need, the solar panels that we're going to need, the wind energy that we're going to need, the reconstitution of steel and cement production that we're going to need. And what we ought to be doing is having a government-private partnership in creating the technologies that are going to be necessary to tackle climate. Electric vehicles could be a great example. One of the examples I give in the book is Lordstown, Ohio, which has had a plant shut down. Why don't we have federal funding through the Federal Financing Bank saying, if you open up an electric vehicle SUV factory there, we're going to fund it. And that's why I come back to this image of Intel creating these jobs in New Albany, Ohio. You know, if that had happened with Donald Trump, he would have been camped in Ohio saying he's brought back 3,000 jobs. We've got to look at tech, not just as, oh, you go become a coder. It's one of the worst images that we've created. Oh, you know, how can you make a coal miner a coder? Of course you can't, or it's silly. I mean, maybe 1 out of 100. But technology also means manufacturing jobs. It also means clean technology jobs. It also means retail jobs. It doesn't often require a college degree. And technology should be mobilized in the service of meeting our climate goals. In fact, I would argue we can't successfully address the climate crisis without massive investment in technological innovation.
And that investment definitely has to come from the top, from the federal level. Congress has to lead on this issue. What are you hearing now from your colleagues in the Senate about the climate legislation in the Build Back Better Act?
Well, let me say something provocative. We have got to do climate. If we don't, in the Build Back Better, we got to get climate. I'm willing to compromise bluntly on almost anything else if I can get climate. And if I can even get the 500 billion, 400 billion in new climate investment, that is a win. You know, what happens if for some reason the 2022 election doesn't go our way? I'm still hopeful it will, but it would be arrogant to say you know the results. Then where are we on the climate goals? How in the world are we going to hit 50% emission reduction by 2030 if we have no action now and no action in the next few years? This is our best chance. Every person who is progressive, who cares about climate, in my view, should be saying, take a deal that moves the ball on climate. That is my perspective, and that is what I'm going to be working on. I think we can get there as long as we're pragmatic about it and realize that may mean compromising a number of other goals that I care very deeply about.
I mean, have you had the chance to speak with Senator Manchin or Sinema about what they oppose in regards to climate in the Build Back Better Act?
I have a very good relationship with Senator Manchin, and my sense is he's actually for a lot of the investment portions, on innovation portions of climate. Now, we have respectful disagreements on parts of it, and you know, I don't know in detail where he is right now on the methane fee or a number of parts. I was for the clean electricity program. Obviously, he had problems with it. But even if we got 400 to 500 billion in climate innovation and spending that is going to help unleash solar, wind, electric vehicles, and energy efficiency in America, and put us somewhat at a level playing field with the fossil fuel industry, that would be an enormous win. And two things on this regard. I mean, I'm chairing the Environment Subcommittee on Oversight, where we had the big oil executives for the first time in the history of this country testify under oath. We're going to have another hearing where we're getting the board of directors, all those people who got elected on Engine One, where the activists, where the agents of change. I'm calling them in to see, are they really the agents of change? Are they going to stand there and just give the party line like Darren Woods did at Exxon CEO? Or are they going to say, you know what, some of the past Exxon CEOs or Chevron CEOs who said that climate change is not human cause were wrong and false, and we apologize. Anyway, the point is we have to hold them to account. We have to make these investments, and we've got to get that done. And we've got to also stop. One of the big things I'm pushing is to stop giving this tax credit for oil, enhanced oil recovery, where you have carbon positive things getting tax credits. You're capturing the carbon instead of storing it in the ground, which is very difficult. It's going to pump more oil. That whole process is carbon positive, and we're giving that a tax credit. That's absurd.
Yeah, let's talk about those hearings last fall. And what did you want Americans to learn from that hearing?
The extraordinary harm these companies have done, because if they were just honest in the 1970s and 1980s and had said, yes, human activity, human burning of fossil fuels causes climate change, and that we have to do something about it, people would have said, okay, we understand. We need gas still. We need to drive our cars. It's probably more necessary than tobacco. We get that, but at least we could have a plan. Maybe we can have a plan of 1% reduction every year and a diversification of energy. And had we started that in the 70s and 80s, it would not have been nearly as difficult. It would not have been nearly as painful. But they lied to us again and again and again, and they still are lying to us. I was hoping they'd at least come out and say, yes, we were inaccurate. We were misled people in the past. I apologize. So that was part of it. And then to say, what are they doing now? Now they all want to be the new green companies. They say we're pledging, we're pledging that we're going to be carbon neutral on our emissions by 2050. Exxon says that. Well, you know what they're talking about? They're talking about their scope 1 and scope 2 emissions, meaning they will be carbon neutral by 2050 on emissions coming from their production facilities for oil. But it has nothing to do with the product they're selling. So that will still be having carbon out there. And we're trying to actually drill down on what they're saying so people aren't misled about their promises and hold them to account of what they actually have to do to live up to the Paris Accords.
You mentioned that there's going to be another hearing in a couple of weeks. What will be different about this hearing than the first hearing?
These individuals will be coming in on October 8th, have explicitly been elected, saying that they're agents of change. They get climate. They were elected by shareholders like Engine One, who wanted a climate activist on the board. So I'm going to ask them, do you really think when a past Exxon CEO, I mean, I'm happy to telegraph the questions, but do you really think when a past Exxon CEO said that burning fossil fuels does not cause climate change, that they were giving statements consistent with the science at the time? Of course they weren't. And anyone who were to say yes to that would be totally undermining their own credibility. And then if they said that, we would know there's no such thing as changing these companies from the inside, and all of this was smoke and mirrors. If they do come out and are honest about it, they'll be contradicting their CEO, and maybe they start to have some change in these organizations. So I want to try to push these companies. The goal is to push these companies to actually live up to their commitments to the Paris Accord, and to start to be honest about their role in the crisis and what they need to do to change.
Well, you are the chair of the House Oversight and Reform Subcommittee on Environment. So what more should we expect from this subcommittee over the next year?
Well, we'll be issuing a huge report on these big oil hearings in our investigation. And again, I mean, we had Professor Orsekis and some of the great leading minds who've been dedicated their lives to research on this, tuning in because they were so excited that for the first time we're getting these people under oath making statements for the historical record. We're also going to be doing hearings on the wildfires in California, in my state, and whether the commercial logging is exacerbating them. Carol King, who's been a great environmental activist, is going to be participating. We're going to do some hearings on lead removal, the removal of lead pipes, and the removal of lead in airplanes. There's a lot of fossil fuel, leaded fuel in airplanes that in certain airports is causing huge problems for kids who live near those airports. And we're going to be pushing on issues of the ERCOT and role in Texas and the power failure and what we need to do to diversify energy sources. So we've got a full year, but the bulk of the activity is on big oil and holding them accountable.
Yeah, I think this subcommittee is a really good example of just what Democrats are wanting to do to promote a more sustainable, just a better environment, more habitable planet for everyone. Last fall, we spoke with your colleague, Representative Sean Casten, and he made it clear that yes, while Joe Manchin is an impediment to climate change legislation, there's also 50 Republican senators that refuse to vote for anything climate related. It's not just in the Senate, it's in the House as well. Why do you think that Republicans aren't willing to work with Democrats on climate legislation?
Their base has been fed misinformation. They're getting so much of their support and funding from the oil and gas industry, and they're proud of it. I mean, if you look at the hearings and you look at the Republican statements, you could almost make a montage. They all started out with a tribute to the CEO of Chevron or Exxon and how they're essential for American greatness. And so this is their constituency. And it's sad, but I think the miscalculation they're making is that the young voters, climate is not as partisan. There are Republicans who get the climate, there are Democrats who get the climate, especially in states like Florida and California. And so you have some of the Republicans in states like Florida and in the Midwest, where there were huge consequences of a climate with severe weather, starting to say, look, we're kind of out of touch here. We need to change this for the long run. The problem is we don't have the long run in terms of waiting. And do I think 20 years from now, they'll probably come around? Sure, but we don't have 20 years. So that's why this moment is so important. And it's important that we get people who are progressive recognizing that, because the reality is one of two things are going to happen. Either we get a compromise that has climate, or we get nothing. And if we have a compromise and progressives say no, 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 and start attacking it, we really run the risk of having nothing. And so if we can mobilize, in my view, around climate being the top priority and have the willingness to compromise to get that, I think that's our best chance.
Well, ultimately, what do you think will happen with the Build Back Better Act?
Well, I'm an optimist. I believe we will get a new bill that'll have a few priorities that climate will be the pillar of. Probably has something like universal preschool, because that's something that everyone agrees on. Probably has some expansion of Medicaid and health insurance, given that we're in a pandemic. It won't have all of the goals that we need. It will not be nearly ambitious enough as I articulate all the things we need in my book of what gives a person a fair shot at life. But it will be a step in the right direction. And if we can get anything that I think moves the needle on climate and has significant investment, I would be an enthusiastic advocate for passing such a bill.
I definitely hope for the state of the world that bill gets passed. That's for sure. So for our audience, if you want to learn more about how we can democratize the benefits of technology while also regulating the industry in order to make it more fair and just, definitely check out Dignity in a Digital Age, Making Tech Work for All of Us. We'll be sure to link to it in the show notes. Representative Khanna, thank you again for joining the Climate Pod.
Ty, thank you for the work you're doing. Enjoyed very much the conversation.